We don't bargain with killers. The ship moved through the dark like a quiet thought, and the stars outside the window did not care about what had happened 6 days ago, and they did not care about 3 billion dead, and they did not care about a species that had laughed and built cities and raised children, and was now almost completely gone from the universe. Ambassador Selene Voss stood at the window of the asterisk Unce Resolute and looked at those stars and felt something hard and cold sitting in the center of her chest, and she had been feeling it since the first casualty report came through, and she had not been able to shake it since. Lieutenant Darrow Mekai walked up beside her, and he was young, and he had good eyes, and he held a data tablet in both hands the way a person holds something they are not sure they want to give to someone. The final numbers came in, he said. She already knew what he was going to say, but she let him say it anyway. 3,400,000,000, he said, in 6 days. Selene did not say anything for a moment, and then she said, "How many survived?" "Somewhere between 11 and 14,000, Darrow said. The Yelhari were not a large species to begin with. They had 2 home worlds and several colony stations. The Drath hit all of them inside the same 72-hour window, so no one could warn anyone else. It was coordinated. It was planned well in advance." "I know," Selene said. "Earth Command sent an updated brief," Darrow said, and he held the tablet a little higher. "They want you to follow standard council protocol. They are authorizing you to participate in formal negotiations and to support whatever resolution the majority of delegates agree upon." Selene took the tablet and read the authorization, and then set it down on the ledge beside the window. "Okay," she said. Darrow looked at her like he was not entirely sure what okay meant in this context, but he did not push further, and he was smart enough to know when a conversation was finished. The Galactic Council's conclave hall sat inside a massive orbital station above the neutron star Vareth Prime, and it had been built 400 years ago, when 12 species first decided that talking was better than burning, and over the centuries more species had joined, and the hall had been expanded again and again, until it could seat representatives from 112 different civilizations at one time. It was an impressive place, and most species felt something close to reverence when they entered it for the first time. Selene had felt that way the first time too. She did not feel that way today. She walked through the wide corridor that led to the main chamber, and the walls were lined with carved symbols from every member species, and there were banners and lights, and the soft hum of translation technology running in every surface and above every seat and woven into every piece of clothing every delegate wore. The session had been called an emergency session, but it did not feel like an emergency inside these walls. It felt like business, and it felt like procedure, and it felt like something that had been done before many times without much changing afterward. She found her seat at the far end of the long curved table, and she sat down, and she looked at the room. There were beings of every shape and size and color seated around that table, tall ones and small ones and ones that breathed different air through filters built into their collars, and ones whose skin moved with patterns that their own species used as a form of expression. It was a remarkable gathering by any measure, and under different circumstances Selene would have found it genuinely wonderful. But her eyes moved past all of them, and found the Drath delegation at the far opposite end of the table. There were 4 of them, and they were large and their scales were deep green-black, and they moved with the slow ease of creatures that had never once in their long history been made to feel afraid of consequences. And at the center of their group sat High Consul Orith Ka, who was the head of Drath Foreign Relations, and who had personally overseen the diplomatic framing of what his government was now calling a sovereignty enforcement action. He wore ceremonial robes that were the deep red color the Drath used to mark military victory. He wore them to a diplomatic session. He wore them in front of the last surviving delegate of the species his government had just destroyed. Selene looked at him for a long time, and he did not look back at her because she was human, and humans were small and new, and not worth the attention of someone like him. She looked away from him and looked up at the observer gallery that ran along the upper level of the hall, and she found the Yelhari delegate almost immediately, because Atha was the only one up there, and because she was wrapped in a silver thermal blanket, and because the bioluminescent light that ran along the skin of her kind, that beautiful soft glow that Yelhari produced naturally when they were calm or happy, was almost entirely dark. Atha was old and she was alone, and she sat very still, and she watched the table below with eyes that had seen things no being should have to see. Selene held her gaze for a moment, and something passed between them that did not need translation. The session opened with the standard greeting recited by the council's presiding voice, a rotating position currently held by a Zen elder named Facilitator Quess, who was ancient and careful, and who had spent 3 centuries building his reputation as a patient and fair moderator. He welcomed all delegations and acknowledged the gravity of the situation, and expressed the council's collective grief for the losses suffered by the Yelhari people. And he did all of this in a tone that was measured and respectful, and also completely bloodless. Then the floor was opened for opening statements, and several delegates spoke about the importance of dialogue and the necessity of maintaining galactic stability, and the shared responsibility of the Council to find a resolution that all parties could move forward from. Every time someone said the phrase, "all parties," Selene felt the cold, hard thing in her chest grow a little heavier. All parties included the Drath. All parties included the ones who had done the killing. The delegates were not cruel people, most of them. They were practical people who lived in a galaxy that had many powerful forces in it, and who had learned over long centuries that the best way to survive was to absorb the shock of terrible things and smooth them over and keep moving, because the alternative was conflict, and conflict was expensive and dangerous, and no one wanted to bleed for someone else's tragedy. Selene understood this logic. She had understood it for years. She had watched humanity slowly adapt to it since joining the Council 14 years ago, and she had watched human diplomats learn to soften their language and qualify their outrage, and find the careful middle ground that kept everyone comfortable. She had done it herself. Not today. High Consul Orithka rose from his seat, and the room went attentive in the way that rooms go attentive when the most powerful person in them decides to speak, and he spread his hands wide in the traditional Drath gesture of open negotiation, and he let a slow, satisfied expression settle across his face, and he looked around the room at all the delegates who were waiting to hear what terms he would offer. And then he looked at the far end of the table, and for the first time he actually looked at Selene Vos. "Shall we begin the terms?" he said. It was not a question the way he said it. It was an announcement. It was a man declaring that the part where anyone pretended to be upset was now over, and the real business of deciding how little the Drath would give up could finally begin. Every head in the room turned toward the human ambassador, because something was wrong with the expected shape of the moment. Selene Vos was already standing. "We don't bargain with killers." She did not raise her voice, and she did not make a dramatic gesture, and she did not look around the room to check if people were watching her. She just stood up and she looked at Orithka and she said it. "We don't bargain with killers." 7 words. The translation matrices carried those 7 words into 41 languages at the same time, and every delegate heard them in their own tongue, and every species processed them through their own cultural understanding, and every single one of them went completely still. The room did not erupt. It did not fill with shouting or gasping or the sound of chairs scraping back. It simply stopped the way a clock stops, and in that frozen silence, every being present seemed to be trying to figure out how to categorize what they had just heard. Orithka did not move for 3 full seconds, and those 3 seconds were the most honest thing he had shown the room all day, because they revealed that he had not expected this, and that he did not have an immediate answer for it, and that somewhere beneath his ceremony and his red robes, and his centuries of untouchable confidence, something small and sharp had just landed in an unexpected place. Then he recovered and he tilted his head, and he smiled the way powerful people smile when they decide to treat something as beneath them, rather than admit it rattled them. The human delegate appears to be confused about the nature of this session, he said. She is not confused, Selene said. Facilitator Quest leaned forward from the presiding chair, and his ancient voice was very careful when he spoke. Ambassador Voss, the council recognizes your presence and your right to speak, however the protocol of this session calls for. I know the protocol, Selene said. I have sat in this room for 9 years and I know every line of it. I am not violating it. I am exercising the right of any member delegate to state a position. And my position is that the Terran Republic does not participate in negotiations whose purpose is to determine what price is acceptable for the destruction of an entire people. The silence that followed was different from the first silence. The first silence had been shock. This one was something more complicated. It was the silence of beings who were thinking very fast. To understand why 7 words could do what they did to that room, it helped to understand what the other species had quietly learned about humans in 14 years of watching them. Humans were not the strongest species in the council, not even close. They had one home world and a handful of colonies, and their ships were competent, but not exceptional, and their biology was soft and their lifespans were short. And when they first joined the council, most of the older civilizations had regarded them with a kind of polite patience, the way experienced adults regard an enthusiastic child who has just joined a serious game. But over 14 years, certain things had been quietly noted and quietly discussed in the private channels that ran between delegations. The first thing was that humans did not seem to process fear the way other species did. Most civilizations that lived long enough developed a deep institutional caution, a preference for survival over principle that had been burned into them by whatever catastrophes had shaped their history. But humans had catastrophes in their history too, and they had come out of those catastrophes with something strange. They had come out angry in a way that stayed functional. A kind of anger that did not make them irrational, but instead made them move forward when everything reasonable said to stop. The second thing was that humans had a word, atrocity, and when they used it, they meant something specific and absolute, and when they decided something was an atrocity, they did not seem able to simply file it away and continue as normal. Every other long-lived species had developed the capacity to do exactly that, to feel the weight of a terrible thing, and then set it down because the alternative was unbearable. But humans picked it up and carried it and let it change them. The third thing, and this was the one that made the older species most uneasy, was that humans had done terrible things to each other, and they knew it, and they had written it all down, and they taught it to their children, and they never let themselves forget what they were capable of. And what that meant was that, when a human looked at something like what the Drath had done to the Yelhari, they were not seeing an abstract tragedy happening to someone else. They were seeing something with a name they already recognized, and that recognition produced a response that other species found genuinely unpredictable. Facilitator Quest had read every intelligence brief on human psychology, and he understood all of this, and it was exactly why he was so careful right now. Orithka was not careful. This is a disruption of lawful council proceedings, he said, and his voice had dropped to the register that Drath used when they were genuinely displeased. The Terran Republic is a provisional member with no enforcement authority and no military presence sufficient to back whatever posture its delegate is currently performing. I suggest the human ambassador sit down before she embarrasses her government. Several things happened at the same time. Darrow Mecha up in the aides gallery looked at his communicator, and his face changed. 2 delegates from smaller species, the Velhari collective representative and a young Thene diplomat, looked at each other. And Selene Voss reached into her jacket and placed a single data chip on the table in front of her, and did not sit down. 3,400,000,000 people, she said, in 6 days. We have the full record, the attack plans, the coordination logs, the communication between Drath Military Command and the civilian population centers they targeted first. The Yelhari were not a military threat. They had no warships. They had no weapons capable of reaching Drath space. They were killed because someone decided they were in the way, and because everyone in this room has spent 3 centuries making it very clear to the Drath that there would be no real cost for doing this. The room was very quiet. So no, she said, we are not going to sit at this table and negotiate what percentage of their stolen territory the Drath might graciously return. We are not going to discuss economic penalties that will be quietly waived within a decade. We are not going to write another agreement that means nothing and file it next to the 16 agreements before it that also meant nothing. She looked directly at Orithka. We don't bargain with killers. She said it again the same way she had said it the first time, not louder, not harder, just clear and flat and final like a door closing. And this time Orithka's face did not recover in 3 seconds. Down in the docking bay of Varath Station, the sensors had picked up something 20 minutes ago that no one in the room had announced yet. 3 additional human warships had come out of faster-than-light travel and taken up quiet positions alongside the UNSS Resolute. They were not pointing weapons at anyone. They were simply there. The way a person stands beside someone in a difficult moment, present and deliberate, and not going anywhere. Orithka had intelligence briefings on human psychology, and one of the most consistent notes across all of them was a single observation that his analysts had flagged as significant. Humans did not bluff. They were capable of being wrong, and they were capable of being outmatched, and they were capable of losing badly. But the word * bluff as other species used it, the strategic display of strength or conviction one did not actually possess, seemed to sit uncomfortably against something in the human character. When they said a thing, they meant the thing, and when they committed to a position, they had already accepted the cost of holding it. Orithka looked at Selene Voss, and for just a moment the ceremony fell completely away from his face, and what was underneath it was not anger. It was something much more useful to Selene. It was uncertainty. We don't bargain with killers. The recess was called 20 minutes after Selene sat back down, and it was not a planned recess. Facilitator Quest called it because the session had stopped functioning as a session and had become something else entirely, and he was experienced enough to know when a room needed to breathe. Delegates filed out into the wide corridor outside the chamber, and the noise level rose immediately. Not shouting, but the dense, urgent murmur of beings who had a great deal to say to each other and very little time to say it. Selene walked to the far end of the corridor, where a long observation window looked out at the star field, and she stood there alone for about 4 minutes before Facilitator Quest found her. He was very old, and he moved slowly, and his robes were the pale gray of the Zen Communion scholar caste, and he had kind eyes that had seen a very long time pass, and he stood beside her and looked out the window for a moment before he spoke. "You understand what you have done," he said. "Yes," she said. "You have made this personal," he said. "The Council does not function well when things become personal. It was designed specifically to prevent things from becoming personal. That was the entire point of the design." "I know," she said. "The Drath have allies here," Quest said. "Not many who like them, but many who fear the instability that comes from confronting them directly. You have given those delegates a reason to align with Orithka, not because they agree with him, but because they want this to end quietly, and you have made quiet much harder." Selene was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "How many times has the Council negotiated with the Drath after an action like this?" Quest did not answer immediately. 17 times, Selene said. I counted 17 sessions across 300 years, 17 sets of terms and penalties and agreements. And the Drath are still doing this, and the species they have done it to are still gone, and the agreements are still filed somewhere where nobody reads them. Your design has had 3 centuries to work, facilitator, and what it has produced is 17 funerals that were called diplomatic resolutions. Quest was quiet for a long time. What you are describing, he finally said, is not something the Council can solve in a single session. I am not trying to solve it in a single session, Selene said. I am trying to stop this one from being the 18th. Quest looked at her and his expression was complicated. It was not hostile. It was the expression of someone who believed she was right and was afraid of what that meant. Be careful, he said, and then he walked away. Orith Ka did not approach her in the corridor. He sent a message. It came through the standard diplomatic communication channel, and it was written in the formal language that Drath used for intergovernmental correspondence, and it was very polite on the surface and very threatening underneath the surface, and Selene read it twice, and then she forwarded it without any editing or added commentary to the personal consoles of every single delegate in the building. The message had suggested that humanity was too new and too small to make enemies it could not manage, and that the Terran Republic should carefully consider whether its ambassador's behavior reflected the kind of judgment a provisional member species ought to be displaying, and that there were many ways in which the Drath hegemony could make the next decade very uncomfortable for a civilization that was still in the early stages of establishing itself in galactic space. It was a threat, and it was not even a subtle threat. It was dressed in formal language, but the shape of it was completely clear. Stand down or we will hurt you. By the time delegates returned to the chamber, every one of them had read it. The room felt different when everyone sat back down. Something had shifted in the atmosphere in a way that was hard to define but easy to feel, and Selene noticed it immediately. And so did Darrow up in the aides gallery, because he sent her a single short message that said the Velhari delegate is looking at you differently. She looked up. The Velhari collective's representative was a middle-aged male named Esoth, and his species were small and blue-gray, and they had 3 star systems and a modest fleet, and they had lived inside the long shadow of the Drath for 160 years, and they had learned to be very careful and very quiet in rooms like this one. He was looking at Selene, the way someone looks at a fire they are not sure is safe to stand near, but also cannot quite make themselves walk away from. Their eyes met. He nodded. It was a very small nod, and it was quick, and he looked away immediately after, and Selene did not react visibly, but something shifted slightly in her chest. Not the cold, hard thing. Something else, something that felt like the first small movement of a door. Then the Thene Compact's young diplomat, a female named Varus who had been the quietest person in the room all morning, picked up her water vessel and moved it 3 inches to the left and set it down, and that was it. But Darrow knew enough about Thene body language to recognize it as a deliberate signal of alignment, and he sent Selene another message that said Thene is with you. And then one more delegate shifted in their seat, and another picked up their data tablet and turned it face down on the table in the Velhari gesture of refusing to participate in what was about to be proposed. They were small movements. They were the kinds of movements that would not be written about in the official record of the session. But the room was full of beings who had spent their careers reading exactly these kinds of movements, and they all saw them, and the atmosphere shifted again. Orith Ka saw it too, and he decided to accelerate. He requested the floor, and Quest granted it, because the protocol required it, and Orith Ka stood, and he spoke with great formal authority about the Council's founding principles, and the importance of sovereign rights, and the dangerous precedent that would be set if member species were allowed to use emotional language to derail legitimate diplomatic processes. He was good at this. He had been doing it for decades. He knew how to wrap a self-interested argument in the language of principle, and he knew how to make the desire to avoid consequences sound like wisdom. When he finished, 3 delegates immediately signaled support for returning to the standard negotiation framework. Selene requested the floor. Quest looked at her for a moment and then granted it. She stood, and she did not look at Orithka this time. She looked at the delegates who had just signaled support for resuming negotiations, and she spoke directly to them. "I want to ask you something," she said, not as a challenge, as a genuine question. "When you go home from this session and your children ask you what happened today, what are you going to tell them?" The 3 delegates did not answer because the question was not meant to be answered out loud. "I'm going to tell my people that we looked at what happened to the Yelhari and we said no," Selene said. "I am going to tell them that we decided that there are things you do not negotiate and people you do not bargain with, because the moment you start bargaining you have already agreed that the thing they did has a price, and that a price can be paid, and that paying it is the end of the matter. And I cannot accept that. My species cannot accept that. And I do not think most of the species in this room actually accept it either. I think most of you are just very tired and very scared, and I understand both of those things completely." She paused. "But tired and scared is how we got here," she said. "Tired and scared is 17 sessions. We are not going to get a different result by being tired and scared one more time." She sat down. Darrow's message came through 12 seconds later. It said *6 delegates just turned their tablets face down *. We don't bargain with killers. The vote was called in the late afternoon session when the artificial lighting in the conclave hall had shifted to its warmer evening register, and long amber light fell across the curved table and across all the faces seated around it. The motion was simple: resume formal negotiations with the Drath hegemony under standard council protocol, yes or no. Facilitator Quest read the motion aloud in the measured tone he used for everything, and the room listened. And when he finished, he opened the floor for final statements before the count was taken. Orithka gave one, and it was long and composed, and he cited 3 centuries of council precedent, and he cited the founding charter, and he cited the economic interdependencies between Drath space and a dozen other civilizations, and he made it sound like voting no was not a moral decision, but a reckless and childish one that only a species with no understanding of how the galaxy actually worked would make. He did not look at Selene once during the entire statement. 2 of the 3 delegates who had pledged their support to him spoke after. They were careful, and they talked about stability and long-term frameworks, and the importance of process, and they were not wrong that process mattered, and they were not wrong that stability mattered, and they were completely wrong about what mattered most right now, and Selene thought that this was the particular tragedy of experienced people. They had learned so many real lessons that the lessons had started to get in the way of each other. Then Selene stood for her final statement, and she did not give a long speech. She said, "Before the vote, I am invoking Article 44 of the Founding Charter." The room went still in a very specific way. Article 44 was old. It was one of the original provisions written 400 years ago when the Charter was first drafted, and it had been written by a coalition of smaller species who had worried even then that the Council could become a place where the powerful made decisions over the heads of the destroyed. And it stated that in any session where a species had suffered extinction-level violence, the sole surviving delegate of that species held the right to address the full council before any binding vote was taken. It had never been used. It had been forgotten by most current delegates and was known to specialists in council history, and to anyone who had spent many years reading the founding documents very carefully. Facilitator Quest looked genuinely surprised, and then he looked at the charter text on his console, and then he looked at the observer gallery where Atha sat in her thermal blanket, and then he looked back at Selene. "The article is valid," he said, "and the right is recognized. Atha of the Yelhari, the floor is yours if you choose it." The room waited. For a long moment nothing happened, and Selene wondered if Atha had heard, or if she was too exhausted or too deep in her grief to want to do this, and Selene would not have blamed her at all for any of those things. Then the old Yelhari woman stood up slowly, and she walked to the speaker's gallery railing, and she looked down at the table below, and she began to speak. Her language was soft and clicking, and full of sounds that did not exist in most other species' vocal ranges, and as she spoke the bioluminescent patterns along her skin moved slowly. Not the bright happy pulses her kind produced in good times, but something quieter and deeper and more complicated. A slow tide of pale blue and silver that moved across her face and her hands and her neck. She spoke for 4 minutes. The translation came through quietly in every delegate's earpiece. She did not give a political speech. She did not argue for justice or cite international law or appeal to the Council's founding ideals. She described a morning. She described waking up in her city on the second Yelhari home world 6 days ago, and the sound the market made outside her window in the early hours, and the way the light came through the tall windows of her building, and the names of the children who lived across the street, and what they argued about and what they laughed about, and what the oldest one wanted to be when she grew up. She described eating breakfast with her daughter. She described the alert that came through and the sound of the sky changing. She described the silence after. She did not cry while she spoke. She was past the part where crying was possible. She was in the much quieter place that comes after, and she stood there in that quiet place, and she shared it with the room, and the room received it, and nobody spoke. When she finished, she stood at the railing for one more moment, and then she walked back to her seat and wrapped the thermal blanket around herself and sat down, and the pale blue light on her skin faded slowly back to almost nothing. The vote was called. The count took 4 minutes. When Quest read the result, his voice was as measured as always, and it revealed nothing, and it said everything. 51 votes against resuming negotiations. 47 in favor. 14 abstentions. The motion to negotiate with the Drath hegemony failed. It was the first time in 300 years that a motion of that kind had failed in this room, and the significance of it moved through every delegate present like a physical thing, and several of them sat with it in total silence for a moment before anyone moved or spoke. Orithkai stood. He stood slowly, and he straightened his red robes, and he looked around the room with an expression that was no longer performing calm. It was the real face of a powerful entity that had just encountered a wall where it expected an open door, and was deciding what to do about it. The Drath hegemony does not recognize this result as legitimate, he said. We view this vote as a hostile act against our sovereignty and our people. The hegemony formally withdraws from the Galactic Council effective immediately, and we will treat any further interference in our internal affairs as an act of war. He walked out. His 3 delegation members walked out behind him. The door closed. The room was silent for a long moment. Then somewhere in the distance, the deep harmonic tone of large ship engines came through the walls of the station. The Drath fleet beginning its positioning sequence, beginning to move toward a jump formation that would take them out of the system. Selene had not moved from her seat, and she was already looking at her communicator, and the message from Earth Command was already there waiting for her. It was short. Ambassador Voss, you have exceeded your authorized parameters. You are ordered to stand down and await further instruction, Earth Command. She read it. She set the communicator face down on the table. She looked up. In the station's external sensor display visible on the wall screens, the Drath fleet was moving into jump formation. 47 warships turning slowly in the dark and pointing themselves toward the edge of the system. And then something happened that no one had planned or coordinated, and that Selene had not asked for, and that no human signal had produced. The Velhari Collective's 3 ships, old ships, battered ships. Ships that had no business standing in front of a draft fleet of that size moved into the draft's jump corridor. They did not fire. They just moved there. And then the Thene Compact's 2 ships moved there. And then 7 more vessels from 7 different species moved there. Not because anyone told them to, but because something had broken open in that room when an old woman described a morning and named the children on her street, and they had all heard it in their own languages through their own histories, and they had recognized it, and they were tired and scared, and they had decided that today they were going to be tired and scared and present at the same time. Selene looked at the screen. The draft fleet stopped its jump sequence. Humanity's 4 ships had not moved. They were still off to the side, watching, because this was no longer humanity's moment alone. This was what happened when a room full of beings who had been quiet for too long heard someone say out loud the thing they had all been thinking. The cold, hard thing in Selene's chest was not gone, but something had moved beside it. Something that felt like the very beginning of something real. We don't bargain with killers. The draft did not jump that night. They sat at the edge of the system for 11 hours with their engines running and their weapons charged, and the small coalition of ships blocking their exit corridor sitting quietly in front of them, and neither side did anything, and the whole galaxy seemed to hold its breath and wait for someone to make the decision that would end it one way or another. It did not come. At the 11th hour, the draft fleet powered down its jump drive and moved into a holding position, and sent a single message to the council station that said they were prepared to discuss conditions for a ceasefire. Not a negotiation about the Yelhari. Not an offer of terms. A ceasefire. Which meant they were acknowledging that something had changed, and they did not yet know the shape of the new thing they were dealing with, and they needed time to understand it before they decided what to do next. Selene read the message and handed it to Darrow and said, "Tell Earth Command I need to speak with the director personally." "They're not happy," Darrow said. "I know," she said. "Tell them anyway." The formal censure hearing took place on Earth 6 weeks later in a gray building in Geneva that housed the UN Diplomatic Commission, and Selene sat at a long table across from 7 people who were serious and careful, and who had spent their careers building the systems that she had stepped outside of, and they were not entirely wrong to be upset about it. The charge was exceeding authorized diplomatic parameters, and acting without sanction during an active council session, and potentially exposing the Terran Republic to military confrontation with a superior force. Selene did not argue with any of the facts. She had exceeded her parameters. She had acted without sanction. She had done exactly what Earth Command had told her not to do. She said yes to all of it, and she sat straight in her chair, and she did not apologize for the outcome. The commission chair, a tall gray-haired woman named Director Okonkwo, who had 30 years of diplomatic experience, and who had personally negotiated 5 major interstellar agreements, looked at Selene for a long time after she finished speaking. "You understand," the director said, "that if the draft had opened fire, if that standoff had gone differently, we could be at war right now." "I understand that," Selene said. "And you were willing to accept that risk." "I was willing to accept that risk on behalf of my government without my government's permission," Selene said. "That is the part I take full responsibility for. The risk was real, and I made the call alone, and that was wrong as a matter of process. I am not arguing against the censure." "Then what are you arguing?" the director said. Selene was quiet for a moment. "I am arguing that the process was also wrong," she said. "I am arguing that sending an ambassador to a session about the near-total destruction of a species, and authorizing her to support whatever the majority agrees to, is also a decision with consequences. It is just a quieter decision, and the consequences are borne by people who are already gone and can't sit in this room and object to it." The director looked at her for another long moment, and then looked at her notes, and then the hearing continued, and at the end of it, The censure was formally issued and entered into the record, and Seleni's authorization to represent Earth at the council was suspended pending review. She walked out of the building into cold Geneva air. There were people outside. Not a protest exactly, no signs, no chanting, just people standing in the plaza in the gray morning light. And when Selene came through the door, some of them looked up, and then more of them looked up, and the quiet spread outward through the gathered crowd. There were humans there, and there were also beings from other species. Velhari students who were on academic exchange programs at 3 European universities, and who had taken trains overnight to be here, and 2 Thene diplomats who were on a separate mission to Earth, and who had apparently decided to make a detour, and an old Zen philosopher who had crossed 4 star systems, and arrived on Earth 3 days ago for reasons he had not publicly explained. They were not cheering. They were just there, standing in the cold morning, with their breath making small clouds in the air, and their eyes on Selene, and the message of their presence was simple, and it did not need to be translated into any language. Darrow was behind her, and he had been very quiet all morning, and now he said in a low voice, "There are people out here from 9 species." "I see them," Selene said. "The Velhari kids have been out here since before dawn," he said. Selene stood on the steps and looked at all of them for a long moment, and then she nodded once and they nodded back, and that was all, and it was enough. The Velhari Accord was drafted over the following 4 months. It was not a perfect document. Nothing written by a committee of 43 species could be a perfect document. It had compromises in it and language that was softer than it should have been in places, and provisions that certain members refused to sign unless specific clauses were adjusted, and the whole process was slow and contentious and exhausting. But it produced something real. It created a permanent tribunal with actual investigative authority and actual enforcement mechanisms, backed by a standing coalition of 12-member fleets. Not the largest fleets in the galaxy, but enough. And it created mandatory response timelines, so that a situation like the Velhari would trigger a formal response within 72 hours rather than being scheduled for a session that might take weeks to convene. It was not perfect, but it had teeth, and in a body that had spent 3 centuries producing documents with no teeth at all, that was a significant thing. Humanity's seat at the council, the one at the far end of the table, was moved. Quest proposed it, and the motion passed with few objections, and the new position was at the center curve of the table, where the seats of active participating members sat, and the shift was small physically. But every delegate understood what it meant, and most of them had voted for it not as a favor to humanity, but as an acknowledgement that something had changed, and the seating chart should reflect the new shape of things. Atha lived for 11 more years. She never returned to Velhari space, because there was not much of Velhari space left to return to. The 2 home worlds had been badly damaged, and the colony stations were gone. But she settled on a small Velhari world where the climate suited her, and where the bioluminescent flowering plants that grew along the cliffs in the evenings reminded her of something she did not name out loud. She began teaching. She started with 6 students, 2 Velhari children and a young Zen scholar, and 3 humans who had heard about her, and traveled a considerable distance to learn from her. She taught them the Velhari language, the soft clicking tones and the light patterns that ran alongside the spoken words, because Velhari communication was 2-channel, and you needed both to really understand what was being said. Over 11 years, she taught 432 students from 17 species. The language did not die with her. When she passed, her students organized a gathering, and they spoke to each other in Velhari for 3 hours, and the light patterns flickered softly in the dim room, and everything she had given them was alive in them and would go forward in them, and the children on her street had names that would be spoken in a living language for as long as those students and their students remembered them. The Draft Tribunal convened 2 years after the conclave session. The process was long, and the Drath contested every step of it, and there were 3 moments when it nearly collapsed entirely. And the verdict when it finally came was narrower than many had hoped, and the enforcement of it was incomplete and imperfect, and would require years more work. But it happened. For the first time in 300 years, it happened. Darrow Mackay wrote in his personal log on the night the tribunal delivered its verdict, and what he wrote was not a political analysis and not a historical summary. It was a simple observation about something he had been thinking about for 2 years. He wrote that he believed historians would spend a long time arguing about whether Selene Vos had made the right call, and whether she had helped the galaxy or destabilized it, and whether a different approach could have produced a better outcome with less risk, and those were all real questions worth asking. But he wrote that he also believed the most important thing she had done was not the 7 words and not the data chip, and not the Article 44 invocation. The most important thing she had done was stand up before anyone had any idea what was going to happen next. Because the galaxy was full of beings who knew that things were wrong, and who were waiting to see what everyone else was going to do first, and sometimes all that was needed to unlock a room full of waiting people was one person who decided to stop waiting. He closed his log and looked out the window at the stars. Humanity had not arrived in the galaxy with the biggest ships